Sir, I saw them at the dump. The sentence landed between the two of them like a stone dropped into a still pond. Ricardo's hand, which had been halfway toward his pocket to pull out the business card he always carried like armor, went slack at his side. For a breath, he registered only the boy's voice, small, steady, uncowed, and the sizzle of the night wind running over the city's ribs. Then memory, old and stubborn, woke with the force of a tide. He had not planned to stop that evening. The reports on his phone were unread. The board expected a call before midnight. The house was a deliberate economy of silence where the photographs of better mornings gathered dust. He wore his success the way men sometimes wear armor, polished, heavy, efficient. Grief had been a slow leak. It had not made headlines. It had taught him to move faster around the edges of things he could not fix. Outside, under the sodium glare of a street lamp, the dump smelled of damp cardboard, old oil, and the faint warmth of frying, cheap food carried into the margins of the city and consumed with the kind of hunger that is both bodily and the kind that hurts the bones. The boy held a small paper bag cradled like treasure. He looked like he belonged to the place in that way small children can, hands smaller than the stains on his knees, bare feet that had forgiven the rough ground. He had a face that did not look for permission to be seen. Ricardo remembered the exact moment, months back, when his daughter's photograph had ceased to be a protest and had become a manual of absence. It had been 2 years since they stopped speaking, 2 years since the last stubborn message on his phone, an argument about a dinner he missed, an apology that came too late. Whether she had left by her own choice or lost her way, the absence had settled into him like dust. He kept her photograph not because he hoped for contact, but because the image was proof that someone had once belonged to him whom he had failed to hold. Now, the boy's eyes met his. They were bright in a way that dared him to look back. "Come closer," the boy said. "I don't want them to take it." Ricardo crouched out of habit. The city bent to his height. The boy did not look at the suit or the flash of watch glass, only at the small paper bag. When he opened it, the smell rose, warm, spicy, the unmistakable comfort of fried dough. One of the pastries had a small tear where a child's teeth had been generous. It was the sort of snack you could buy from a cart and carry like a secret. "Share?" the boy asked. The offer was a simple thing. The exchange was older than taxes and contracts. Ricardo felt absurdly that he should not have to be asked. He had handed out gifts at charity galas, posed for cameras while people in uniforms accepted checks, signed glossy letters that promised change in the future.
He had built kitchens in satellite programs, donated lines on his ledger, and still, tonight, a small child asking him for half a pastry felt like thunder. He wanted to say yes, because he was a good man in the public eye. He wanted to decline, because in his practical mind, the street was a place of risk. He simply took the other half, the trade of one small hunger for another, and ate it. The hot dough softened the place that grief had carved away. For a moment, the room inside him lit up with nothing complicated at all. Warmth, sugar, human presence. "Thank you," the boy murmured. He watched Ricardo chew, as if trying to learn from the way someone else swallowed comfort. "What's your name?" Ricardo asked. He did not fully recognize the curiosity in his own voice, the way it had softened at the edges. "Mateo," the boy answered. "My abuela says you shouldn't talk to strangers, but she says sometimes you have to." Mateo's grandmother, Dona Nusa, appeared at the edge of the lamplight, a woman whose years had given her a posture of economy and patience. She carried a faded plastic bag with what looked like folded cloth inside. She did not hurry. She didn't need to. Those who live on the margins move like people who have measured time differently. Urgency belongs to those who still have a clock with their name on it. "Nusa, come say hello," Mateo said, with the insolence of the small, who know their own authority over adults. Dona Nusa's face was lined, but it held a quiet dignity. She met Ricardo with eyes that measured him and then made a decision to treat him like a man rather than like a representative of charity. "Good evening," she said. Her voice had a rhythm learned in kitchens and in prayer, in hands that had worked longer than most books counted. Ricardo felt the photograph in his jacket like a small weight against his sternum. He read the flyer often in private.
The girl on it had his eyes, and accusation and a comfort at once. He had, at various moments in the 2 years since, tried to explain the distance between them with words that would not bear repeating. Work demands, failed patience, the slow corrosion of a relationship that neither could admit to saving. He had offered money as recompense, and leaned on the machinery of his wealth to show he cared. Wealth had a language, grief had another. He had spoken the first when his daughter had needed the second. He was surprised at the tenderness that rose in him now, not at the idea of doing something dramatic, but at the clear, personal simplicity of being asked to share a pastry at the edge of a dump. It was a human request. It fit into his throat like a bell. "Matteo," he said, tasting the name. It sounded good. They talked them, the three of them under the sodium light. Matteo asked questions about Ricardo's car and about the city.
He spoke of the birds that nested in the rusted piles and the men who combed for bottles. He said things that children say, plain, direct statements about need. He said, with admirable bluntness, that there wasn't always enough to sleep with. He spoke of the nights his abuela had hoarded blankets. Ricardo listened. Each sentence was a small drum of truth that the polished rooms of his life had not heard in a long time. "You okay?" Nuessa asked him at one point, reading something in his stillness. Ricardo's voice was quiet, embarrassed by its own tremor. "Not always," he admitted. He did not specify why. He did not need to. You did not hand over your sorrow to strangers like you hand over money. Pain was a private ledger, he had been taught. The public ledgers were for philanthropy and neat outcomes. But grief, he felt, needed to be seen sometimes by those who were not afraid of it. Matteo's small eyes watched him, as if trying to figure out where grief sat. "My mama used to be like that," the boy said. "She would go away sometimes and not come back. Abuela says she's in the city." Ricardo swallowed. The walls of the world, the precise, ordered things that had sustained him, appointments, scheduled returns, promises of future fixes, blurred. He realized with a strange clarity that he could have been the man who left. He could have been the man who let the person he loved go. The face on his flyer was suddenly not an ornament, but an accusation, a living proof that absence was not something to be fixed with money, but something that required someone to show up. He promised, without thinking how the promise would be kept, that he would bring something for Matteo and Donna Nuessa the next day: warm bread, a blanket, maybe some soap. Promises had been easy before, when they could be signed and budgeted and ticked off on a spreadsheet. This one felt small and terrible because it was immediate. "If you want," he said, "tell me where you get bread. I'll bring some tomorrow." Matteo smiled as if the word bread itself was a bell. He pointed to a narrow road that split between the dump's rusted fence and a jumble of low houses. Ricardo left with the photograph heavy in his pocket and the smell of frying still on his hands. He drove home with his hands tight on the wheel. The city's neon leaned like a row of judgmental lights into his windshield. He tried to explain the feeling rising in him in practical terms. He would call his assistant, arrange a small program, a culinary job for Donna Nuessa at the company canteen. He would commission an outreach vehicle to deliver food. He could do all of this. He knew how to do money. He did not know still how to do the kind of listening that did not have a meeting attached. Before dawn, his phone buzzed with the usual quarterly alerts, a headline about a merger, a text from Marcelo asking bluntly why Ricardo had missed the strategy call. Marcelo's voice on the other end was businesslike. In a single sentence, he managed to make charity sound like a liability. "We can't turn the firm into a social program," Marcelo said. "There are numbers to protect. Vision is not the same as reckless expenditures." Ricardo heard the logic and felt it as if someone had poured cold water over the warmth the boy had given him. He made excuses about sleep and the edema of grief and promised he'd be at the morning meeting. He did not tell Marcelo about Matteo, or the pastry, or the way a small child could make him feel like a man who had been granted a second chance to do something right. At the office, life ran in its usual orbit. Silver trays of accolades, earnest young executives who believed the metrics could fix everything, a boardroom where bets and expectations moved like a chess game. He let the meeting take him in that afternoon, but his mind kept returning to the dump, to the way the lamplight had made the boy's face look like a place of uncut possibility. 3 days later, he kept the promise to Matteo. He arrived with a small box from a bakery in his hand, not announced, not photographed, simply held like an offering.
Mateo's grinned when he saw the warm bread was worth more to Ricardo than an award plaque. Dona Nesa took the job offer he had found for her with an economy of disbelief that slid into gratitude. Ricardo had not intended to do anything dramatic, no press release, no public spectacle, but the small decision stuck like glue. He offered Dona Nesa a short-term contract through the company's cafeteria program, payment that would be regular, and a room in the apartment building where workers sometimes stayed when there was overflow. He insisted on the paperwork being formal. He wanted dignity in the exchange. He named Silvana from HR as the coordinator, a woman whose steady competence made the thorny things of life look possible. Silvana listened to the plan and then asked the question people always ask when idealism meets bureaucracy. How will this be sustainable? How will we ensure this doesn't become a flood of need and then a washout? It was not cynicism, it was structure. Marcelo would later call the proposal too sentimental. Silvana called it risky but manageable. They set to work in ways Ricardo had not anticipated. Background checks, contract clauses, the logistics of making a staff cafeteria accept someone from the community. The steps were clunky, and for someone used to pressing buttons and seeing immediate results, slightly humiliating. Ricardo had to sign forms and set meetings and endure slides about liability and benefits. He learned a new kind of patience, the kind that asks you to wait while other people catch up to your intention. For Mateo and Dona Nesa, the changes were immediate. A roommate named Lucy offered to take suitcases they could not yet afford. A small room with a window and a metal bed was arranged for a temporary stay.
The boys' school enrollment was started after a few bureaucratic hiccups. There were practical difficulties. The bank needed identification for the payroll setup, municipal paperwork for the housing. But each box checked felt like a stone placed on a path that led away from the garbage heaps. It was during one of those small, pragmatic triumphs that the whisper of the past returned to the surface like a scent. At night, when Ricardo finally allowed himself to unlatch the knots of his chest, he would sit with a faded photo of his daughter and think of the messy human thing he had been avoiding: reconciliation. Not the public sort, with statements and staged apologies, but the private, humble, awkward work of finding someone who had stopped speaking to you and asking to be seen. "He's been asking about your daughter," Silvana said softly one afternoon, handing him a list of documents needed to finalize Dona Nelsa's employment. She said it as if the topic might sting. "Mateo, he asked if she was still around." Ricardo almost dropped the pen. He played it cool. "Why would he?" Silvana shrugged. "Kids hear things. People talk near the dump. Sometimes he hears names." The dump had, in the corners of the city, become a place where stories pooled. People passed rumors as currency there, much like bottles could be salvaged and turned into cash. Ricardo had been at the center of his own rumor mill, a man who had everything but had lost the warm center of his life. He had been certain the only thing he could do was build programs until he either was satisfied or moved on. He had not realized that the act of showing up might stir notes that had not yet been played. He started to go back more often, not for spectacle, not for the camera crews that sometimes lurked to catch corporate heartworms, but because he found himself wanting to watch someone else live a life that was honest and immediate. He wanted to see the effect of the bridge he had thrown out, not for the applause, but to learn how small promises turned into real things. The boy showed him where the bread came from, an old bakery that threw out near-perfect pastries at the end of the day. Ricardo negotiated a small arrangement there, one that respected the bakery owner's dignity and ensured workers were paid for their goods if they were to be given in any sustained program. He learned the names of people who worked with their hands and sometimes did not sleep a full night in a warm bed. He learned that the dump was not only a place of loss, but a makeshift neighborhood with its own rhythms, and that dignity could be found even in a place labeled by others as less. Then, one night, as he stood near the same lamppost where they had first met, Mateo's voice broke into the quiet with a sentence that had the power of an accusation and a key at once. "Sir," Mateo said, and there was grigency in the small boy's voice now, "I saw them at the dump." Ricardo froze. The world, which had been a sequence of tasks and obligations, narrowed to the 3 syllables of the boy's phrase, and to a shadow that took its shape from a thought he had been avoiding like an illness. The pronoun them refused definition, and yet carried all the weight.
He felt the air in his lungs become a small, guarded thing. On impulse, he reached into his pocket for the photograph of his daughter and felt the paper under his fingers as if it were suddenly the hottest thing he had ever touched. "Who?" he asked, but his voice was quieter than he wanted, the question landing like a pebble on glass. Mateo looked toward the fence, toward a part of the dump where the light was thin and the piles were higher. A woman and a girl. They walked away when the men came. They had bags. The girl had a red ribbon. Abuela told me about missing posters once. She said sometimes people go away to find a better place. I think I saw them. Ricardo felt the ground tilt. For a man who had learned to count events as manageable, this was not a report he could parse into a spreadsheet. The possibility it implied, not the closure he had fantasized about in private monologues, but a dangerous, living thread, made his knees hollow. 1,000 small decisions he had made over 2 years telescoped into a single point. Had he missed the chance to look when he could have? Had he left things unlooked for because to face them would mean he had been culpable? There is a thin, cruel second when belief arranges itself in one of 2 ways. You either refuse the possibility because it would demand too much from you, or you allow it, and then you must act. Ricardo felt both at once, the instinct to protect himself with distance and the jagged, unignorable impulse to step into the mess he had avoided. He did not speak for a moment. The lamplight painted Mateo's face in gold and shadow, so that the boy looked simultaneously like someone who belonged wholly to the world and like a messenger from some other, more urgent region. Ricardo thought of the photograph in his pocket, of the ways absence had hardened him, of the neat, polite language he used to describe a loss that had hollowed him out. For the first time in 2 years, the ache in his chest was not a private thing, but a summons. "Show me," he said at last, the tone in his voice less a command than a request that he himself might be saved by. Mateo nodded, as if the city were an easy map to read. Dona Nusa moved closer, her hands folded as if in prayer or as if to warm them. She said nothing, but offered a look that held a history of refusals and survival. They walked. The dump opened into a language of splayed cardboard, glinting plastics, and the soft, secretive movements of people who wore adaptation like armor. There were other figures who watched them pass, expressions not hostile, but wary. Ricardo felt conspicuous in his suit and shoes, and yet also absurdly normal, as if being wealthy no longer explained him.
Mateo pointed. There, by a pile where the city's discards made a small hill, stood a woman with a child's hand tucked into her own. The child had a ribbon in her hair. They were turning away from a group of men who, at a distance, looked like scavengers, arranging what would be their night's work. The sight was brief, a flash that stole breath and left a trace of smoke. Ricardo's first thought, irrational, immediate, was to believe. The photograph in his pocket felt suddenly like a map with its corner torn off. He stepped forward, and the woman and the girl tightened their hold on one another. The woman's face was not his daughter's, but there was a tilt to it that suggested familiarity to a man who had dreamed his daughter's shadow into other faces for 2 years. Then, as if the city itself wanted to test him, one of the men in the circle tossed a scrap of paper that truly was one of those flyers, the sort that went missing from lampposts and the corners of supermarkets, into the gutter. Ricardo saw the name on the poster, the way the light caught the letters. He felt something in his throat close like a fist. He froze where he stood, the exact echo of the hook that had opened the night. "Sir, I saw them at the dump." The sentence folded around him, the world narrowed to the narrowest of possibilities and the largest of demands. He had come to the dump to hand out bread, to keep a promise to a small boy. He had not anticipated that the boy's eyes would find the seam in his life that still bled. He wanted to run, and he wanted to kneel. He wanted to ask the woman if she knew the girl on the photograph, and also know that such a question could scar or soothe in equal measure. He understood now that what followed would not be a press conference or a spreadsheet, but a messy human undertaking, one that might require apologies and listening, and the acceptance that help cannot be given like a bandage and then forgotten.
He could feel the watchful eyes of the men, the quiet curiosity of a vanishing world, and the small, eager look of Matteo, who held a half-eaten cochinilla in his hand like evidence that sometimes the world still made room for simple things. Ricardo's breath caught. The city hummed. He had to decide, in the narrow corridor between the boy's revelation and the woman's retreating back, whether to be the man who had built bridges and speeches, or the man who would cross them when no one was watching. He had to move. Standing still would be a confession that he had been waiting for someone else to do the hard part for him. Ricardo stepped forward, each footfall a small rebellion against the tidy distances his life had been built on. Matteo led the way with the easy knowledge of a child who has walked the same path many times, and who knows which piles will hold the worst smells and which will hide soft things.
The dump unfolded around them, not as a single grotesque thing, but as a patchwork of human improvisation. Tarps stretched like flags, a cluster of people around a small stove, a man who mended shoes with a concentration that made Ricardo feel like an intruder into a private labor. The woman and the little girl were nearer than he thought, under the shadow of a half-collapsed pallet. The girl's ribbon flashed red when she moved, a small, deliberate color in a landscape of dulled cardboard and faded plastic. Ricardo stopped at the edge. He kept his voice low, because he felt ridiculous with the weight of his suit, because he did not want to scare anyone, because he was, in the softest place of himself, afraid of being told the story that would end him as he had been living, a man who saved money more readily than he saved relationships. "Hello," he said. It was lame and necessary. The woman straightened. Her face was compact and quick. She held the little girl's hand the way someone holds an anchor. People whose lives are anchored tense at the first sign of unfamiliar solidity. "Hi," the woman answered, not a welcome so much as a measurement of where she would place her caution. Her voice told him she had practiced for days how to greet strangers who might mean to help or harm. The child beside her clutched a cloth that might once have been bright. The red ribbon in her hair had been folded into a tiny, deliberate knot. Ricardo took, without thinking, the photograph from his pocket and laid it on his palm like a question. He did not want to set the gesture on a table of claims. He wanted the face to be seen like a petition rather than an accusation. The woman glanced, and then, because children are sometimes instruments of truth simply by their presence, the little girl raised her head. There was a flicker across the woman's face when she saw the photograph, the briefest, almost involuntary tightening that betrayed memory, but she did not say the name Ricardo's heart wanted. Instead, she asked, quietly, "Who is she to you?" "My daughter," Ricardo said. Saying the word rearranged the air around him. Daughter, a small legal fact he had not allowed to be tender. The woman's eyes softened for a fraction of a breath, and then returned to the careful neutral line all people who survive by negotiation keep. "I'm Rosa," she said. "This is Leela." The names were offered like a shield. Ricardo felt heat flush his face at the mistake of hoping for the impossible. Leela's ribbon was similar to his daughter's, but so many children choose the same bright thing for reasons that have nothing to do with him. "You saw them?" Ricardo asked, the question simpler than all the paperwork he had ever signed. He did not mean it to be a demand, but he hoped it would be an answer. Rosa's gaze wavered. "I saw a woman and a girl," she said. "They were there the other week, near the north pile. They looked like they were trying to get away from someone."
"The girl had a red ribbon, yes. They had big bags. I thought they belonged to each other." Her voice had the faint burr of someone who had learned to be economical with certainty. Something in Ricardo wanted to throw himself into explanation and apology at once. He did not. Instead, he asked, because it felt like the most direct thing he could still manage, "Do you know if they stayed? Where they went?" Rosa shook her head. They walked off toward the river, past the old bus line. She looked at Matteo, as if the boy could corroborate. Matteo nodded solemnly. He had not been the only witness to the world's small, dangerous movements. Ricardo folded the photograph back into his pocket with hands that trembled a little. He had not expected that this night would offer him a map to closure. He had expected ambiguity, the kind that settles like dust. Yet the image of that woman and the girl walking away, carrying bags, had lodged in him like a hand in a lock, close enough to be opened, if you were willing to try. "Would you let me help?" he asked Rosa. the language awkward because it tried to bridge something unfamiliar. He had to make sure his asking did not feel like an imposition. Rosa blinked. "What help?" "Any," he said. "Food, a place to stay, someone to look up where they might have gone." He looked at her quickly, as if he feared she might read the part of his face that still belonged to boardrooms and PR consultants. "No cameras, no announcements. I don't want to make a scene." Rosa considered him as if weighing the taste of something. "You want to help. Why?" It was the honest, mistrustful question that people who live on the edges ask. In the past, aid often arrived wrapped in strings attached. Ricardo could have answered with a litany of public reasons, image, duty, legacy, but none would have sounded true. Instead, he said the simplest thing he could. "Because I promised a boy some bread, and I'd like to keep that promise. Because there are things I couldn't fix before, and I want to try to fix them now." The explanation was not wholly satisfying, but it was honest. Rosa studied him for a long time, and then, slowly, she nodded. "Tomorrow there's soup near the Blue Drum," she said. "Come then. Talk to Marta. She keeps a ledger." It was a careful offer, not a surrender, but a testing point. Ricardo left the dump that night with the image of the woman and the girl on his mind, and the smell of frying still under his nails. He had crossed a boundary by failing to be content with donations. He had entered the dangerous terrain of expectation. He knew he had to be careful about promising what he was not prepared to make real. When he walked into the office the next morning, the world resumed its familiar rhythms with absurd speed. The soft hum of espresso machines, the clack of keyboards, the polished confidence of people who had never stood with a child and a paper bag in the lamplight.
Marcelo watched him with the same flat curiosity one watches a weather change that might affect one's commute. "You look like hell," Marcelo said without malice, "or like someone found your edit pile and closed it." Ricardo gave a small, unpracticed laugh. "I went by to keep a promise," he said. He named Mateo and Dona Nusa and Rosa with instinctive precision, as if claiming them in company would make the work less raw. Marcelo's eyebrows rose the way currency does when someone suggests an unexpected withdrawal. "We can't be a shelter overnight, Ricardo. We have stakeholders, risk, liability. You're not in the habit of mixing your ledger with your conscience." "That's the point," Ricardo replied. "I'm trying to learn how." Marcelo gave a thin, skeptical smile. "Learning is fine, but this is not a personal charity fund you can spend like allowance. We need policy, oversight, criteria." Ricardo nodded. "I know. That's why I want Silvana involved. I want it to be formal, dignified, contractual when it can be. I don't want my name on a banner. I want people to be paid." Silvana, who had been listening from the doorway of HR, stepped into the conversation with a steadiness that had become a kind of moral gravity in the company. "We can pilot a community hiring program," she said, "with proper screenings, training, and a clear plan for integration. We'll coordinate with local social services for IDs and enrollment. We can create pathways, not favors." Marcelo still looked unconvinced. "And who fronts the overhead?" he asked. "Who handles grievances when it goes wrong? You understand the optics." Ricardo looked at him squarely. "I'll front it. I'll fund a pilot, but I want it to be beyond the spectacle. We will do it in a way that respects people, creates accountability, and scales sustainably." The debate that followed was practical and sterile in the best possible way. Legal frameworks, payroll logistics, employee uptake rates. They sketched a pilot that would hire Dona Nusa in the company cafeteria under a formal contract, create a temporary housing stipend for a room in a nearby worker's residence, and set aside funds to enroll Mateo and Rosa in school and to pay for legal ID processing. Silvana insisted on a clause for cultural orientation for the staff, and Marcelo insisted on metrics and a sunset clause for the pilot. By the end of a long meeting, a plan existed on paper in a way that it had not the night before. The plan meant Ricardo's good intentions were no longer private warmth. They had become a process requiring patience and the ordinary indignity of paperwork. He welcomed the indignity. It meant he had to do things he could not simply buy and forget. That afternoon, he went back to the dump, not for a grand entrance, but to keep his promise to Mateo. He carried a small box of bread and a bag of soap. Mateo's face lit as if the sight of him had been an answer to prayer.
Rosa was there, working at a small tarp stall where she repaired clothes with quick fingers. "You kept your promise," Mateo said, as if Ricardo had fulfilled a covenant. He thrust the half-eaten cochinilla toward him like evidence. Ricardo knelt and handed Rosa a slip of paper with Silvana's contact number and the words hiring and housing written on it. Rosa read it suspiciously, then looked at Ricardo, then at the paper. "You'll help?" she asked. "Yes," he said, the single syllable like a small bell. "And you won't change your mind if people start to expect things?" she asked. "I've seen things promised." "I won't," Ricardo said. He meant it more solemnly than he had intended when he first promised bread. He had promised before, apologized with checks and proposals, and he knew how quickly that had frayed. Now he understood promises required not just funds, but fidelity. The first weeks were a blur of small, stubborn bureaucracies. Silvana and her team collected identity documents, navigated municipal offices that smelled like old coffee and legal ink, and worked with a local NGO to put a tutor together for Mateo. Dona Nesa filled out company forms and received a prospectus of benefits that made her eyes shine with cautious hope. The pilot required that the hires attend a short orientation program in the company kitchen: safety, hygiene, workplace rights. There were background checks and medical clearances, and the odd indignity of proving one's life on paper. Marcelo maintained an air of reluctant watchfulness, asking for reports and timelines. He approved the first payroll adjustments in the same meeting where they discussed projected lunch yields. The paradox made Ricardo almost laugh out loud, the world of spreadsheets trying to find room for human narrative. Around the office, the change migrated slowly. At first, it was a conversation at the water cooler about the new hire in the cafeteria. Then it was when a junior executive, inspired by lunch that tasted like home, volunteered to teach a class on resume writing. Someone offered to donate books. A small mural board appeared in the break room with photographs of the pilot project, faces blurred where anonymity was preferred, and sticky notes filled with practical requests: winter coats, a tutor for Lila, a tablet for Mateno. The company's polished floors had never hosted such a modest, unruly program. For some, it was a nuisance. For others, a new pulse of meaning. Ricardo learned more than he expected about how unspectacular change is achieved. He learned that paperwork often felt like a form of respect. It gave people rights and acknowledgments. He learned that dignity meant contracts and formal pay stubs, not handouts. He learned that people who accept help want autonomy, not pity. Meanwhile, the search for the woman and girl whose outlines had invaded his life continued in parallel with the pilot. Mateo's testimony and Rosa's directions were useful, but not precise.
Ricardo used resources sensibly. He engaged a local social worker, a woman named Lucia, who had a long memory for faces and networks. Lucia walked the neighborhoods, listened at soup kitchens, asked questions with a trust that was born of years of presence rather than money. "What we need," Lucia said on their first meeting, "is patience and an understanding of what you will do when you find them." Ricardo, who had been the kind of man to sign off on blueprints and deliverables, found the question acute. "If I find them," he asked, "I will ask to speak with them. I will not demand anything. I want to offer help. I want to say I'm sorry." Lucia's eyes searched him. Some apologies have more room than others. Money can open doors, but it can also slam them. You need to be prepared for refusal, for anger, for silence. She spoke bluntly. Ricardo took the bluntness like a prescription. Days passed. Mateo went to school and came home with tiny notebooks of half-finished letters and a new vocabulary of numbers. Dona Nusa learned the rhythms of a workplace where comfort stations were clean and the refrigerators were regularly checked. Lila received a small box of donated clothes that fit her like weather. The neighborhood around the dump shifted in small ways. The blue drum that Marta kept as a communal pot became a place for conversation about rights and not just survival. Then, one late afternoon, as autumn breathed cool into the city, Lucia called and asked Ricardo to meet her at a river shelter. "I have a lead," she said. "Not a certainty, but a route to check." At the shelter, Lucia's presence made the place feel less like a stopgap and more like a possibility. She introduced Ricardo to a network coordinator who kept lists and knew how to say things gently so that people who had been hurt by promises could still be curious. "She might be here," the coordinator said, and then added, carefully, "or she might have moved. Where you put your energy matters, sir. People will notice if you come with your fancy suit and a camera. Come humble." Ricardo left the shelter and sat in his car for a long time because humility was not something he carried comfortably. He took off his jacket and picked at a seam. Then he went back in, not as an executive on a mission, but as a man who had promised bread and had found that the promise lodged like a splinter. When he finally encountered the woman from the dump again, it was under different circumstances. She had come to the shelter for blankets. She moved with the same economy of breath and decision that had distinguished her before.
He did not show the photograph. He asked about small, ordinary things. The shelter's hours, whether they accepted donations, who cooked in the mornings. Rosa answered with practicality. They spoke like people who had adopted a language of small, safe topics to test whether new connection could be sustained.
Then, one evening, as they stood by a steaming vat of soup, a figure moved through the shelter who made Ricardo's breath snag. It was a thin woman who walked with a little girl at her hand. There was no dramatic recognition, no cinematic drop of light. The woman's face was turned away as she reached for a ladle, but the tilt of her jaw, the set of the shoulders, the small scar near her eyebrow, details his mind had preserved from his old photographs, assembled in a way that made his chest contract with a particular ache. He moved forward and sat at a distance on a plastic chair that people use when they want to witness something instead of interrupting it. The woman sat with her back to him and fed the child quietly. No soundtrack swelled, only the shelter's ordinary noise, the scrape of metal spoons, a conversation about bus routes, the distant sound of someone practicing a song. Ricardo's heart hammered. He felt an absurd surge of guilt for the life he had led, where you could not see losses without turning them into problems to be solved by systems and budgets. He felt the opposite as well, the urge to throw himself, shame and all, into repair. Lucia came and stood beside him without saying his name. The honest steadiness of her presence was both relief and indictment. "I think that's who you're thinking of," she said softly. "But she might be protective. Don't make assumptions." He nodded. He wanted to ask everything. Why? How? Where? But he understood what Lucia had taught him. There were conversations that required waiting for the person to choose to open. He cannot coerce a reunion. That would be a repeat of all the wrong things he had done in the past. At the end of the night, the woman left with her child. Ricardo watched them go. He caught only a glimpse of an arm and a red ribbon, and it was enough to make him feel that he was on the lip of something that might allow air. Over the next weeks, the search narrowed and branched like roots. The shelter staff spoke of a woman who had been in a program, and who, at some point, had chosen to leave with a child to find work elsewhere. They offered him a name that sounded faintly familiar, Sophia. The name struck him like the echo of a piano note. His daughter's name. For a moment the world tipped again. The possibility rose like a tide, full of danger and a fierce, hopeful force. Ricardo did what he could without using money as leverage. He wrote a note, simple and honest, and left it with Lucia. "I am here if you want to speak. No press, no conditions. I will listen." He left his contact and his promise to help with practical things, paperwork, housing, food. He expected nothing, but he also felt his body loosen the way it does when someone stops holding a breath. People who were grieving built a kind of steady caution into their lives. He had been careful for 2 years. Now he let himself hope in a quiet, disciplined way. The first direct contact came weeks later.
A phone call at dusk from an unknown number. A voice that he recognized in no way except for the way it made him shrink and lean at once. "Is this Ricardo?" the voice asked. It was Sophia's voice, or it wasn't, because time had layered it with a roughness that had not existed in his memory. He could hear a child playing quietly in the background. "It is," he said, the truth, a small miracle on his tongue. There was an intake of breath, a signal that someone was measuring the distance between themselves and the past's peril. "My name is Sophia," she said. "I heard you're looking." Ricardo nearly laughed and nearly cried at once. He steadied himself. "Yes," he managed. "If you want to meet. No cameras. Just talk. Wherever you're comfortable." There was silence long enough that Ricardo worried she had hung up. Then she gave him an address, a community center on the far side of the river, a place that matched the description from the shelter and Lucia's notes. "Midweek," she said finally. "Not the weekend. I work nights. Come in the afternoon." He counted the days. He prepared. Preparation was for him a way to show up respectfully. He picked out clothes that were simple and unshowy. He rehearsed the single true thing he wanted to say. "I'm sorry, and I want to listen." And he turned off his phone as he walked into the center, so that nothing in his life would insist on being more important than the chance to be present. The center smelled of lemon cleaner and boiled cabbage and the faint dust of dozens of small dramas.
Sophia's posture was guarded and strong, as if she had learned to carry the weight of a child and a decision at once. Leela clung to her hand. The child's red ribbon had become a small, stubborn flag of continuity. They sat with chairs arranged in a way that kept the distance yet allowed for crossing. Sophia's eyes were fixed on the floor at first. When she raised her face, it was with a wariness that made Ricardo ache. "You came," she said. "Yes," he said. "I came. He stopped. Because the script he had prepared felt like a stage prop. He tried again. "I am sorry. I'm sorry for the things I didn't see or did not do. I'm sorry for anything I put you through that made you leave." Sophia's fingers tightened around Leela's hand. For a long time she did not speak. She was thin in a way that said she had learned to distribute her energy carefully. "You're not the first to be sorry," she said finally. "And sorry doesn't always change the things that were broken." Ricardo felt both chastened and liberated by the truth. "I know," he said. "I don't want to say it as a talisman. I want to know what help looks like to you. You have the right to say no. You have the right to walk away." Sophia measured him with the distance of someone who had learned to read the world on the thinness of gestures. "I left because I needed space," she said. "I left because I thought it was better not to be tied to the life you wanted for me."
"I couldn't breathe under your plans." There it was, the sharp, honest sentence he had avoided for 2 years. It stung with the truth of a young woman who had tried to claim her own life. Ricardo's grief shifted. It was no longer a private dark pool. It became something that made demands and required repair. "Do you want me to be your father now?" he asked, careful as if asking permission. Sophia looked at him with a face that straddled both his child and an adult who had long since learned how to protect her own heart. "I want boundaries," she said. "I want reliability. I want you to understand that I have my life. I do not want charity. I want respect. If you can do that, maybe we can try." They talked for hours, in fits and long silences. Ricardo listened more than he spoke. He learned about the small ways her life had been made harder, how she had worked nights, how she had kept the child safe by sleeping in shifts with other women, how she had taken odd jobs and had been careful about pride. She had chosen a name for her daughter, Leela, because it felt like a brave, private thing. "Why did you come to the dump?" Sophia asked at one point, the question sharp and simple. Ricardo told her about Mateo and the pastry and the smell of frying in the lamplight. He told her about the photograph he kept in his jacket like a confession. He told her how a boy's sentence had found the seam in his life. "Sir, I saw them at the dump." He did not dramatize. He told stories in the plainness he had learned over the weeks of navigating the city's undercurrents. Sophia's face was unreadable. "So you came because of a pastry," she said, half teasing, half not. "It was a pastry," Ricardo said, "and it was a place where I could see something I'd been avoiding." For the first time in a long while, Sophia let herself imagine a future not as a demand but as a possibility. She agreed to meet again, at intervals she chose. She accepted help that was practical and framed as partnership, assistance getting Leela's birth certificate in order, a small stipend to stabilize temporary housing while she sought work that fit her schedule, access to a community workshop where she could learn trades if she wanted. She did not want charity, she wanted options. Ricardo promised careful things, not grand statements, but the steady work Lucia had recommended, follow-ups, paperwork help, a commitment to privacy. He promised to remove the company from the headline and to insulate Sophia from the machinery that had been part of his life. He asked nothing in return except permission to be present. Outside the center, the city breathed in its ordinary rhythm. Inside, a bridge was being built at the pace of human time, slow, sometimes irritating, occasionally beautiful. Back at the company, the pilot had been running long enough that data points began to appear.
Silvana presented a report showing that morale among cafeteria staff had improved and that employees were engaging in volunteering programs at rates higher than anticipated. Expense sheets balanced against dignity budgets. Marcelo grumbled, but signed the next tranche of funding with a notation that risk needed monitoring. The change radiated in unpredictable ways. An intern who had posted about his volunteer hours received a message from his mother about the impact of seeing the company care. An elderly accountant began bringing spare clothing to a donation drop box. The cafeteria, once anonymous, began to smell like the city again, like cardamom and cumin and fresh bread, because Donna Nilsa worked there, and because her recipes carried the warmth of a life's labor. Ricardo, who used to schedule his compassion into neatly labeled accounts, found himself in a different rhythm. He visited the kitchen without notice. He sat with Mateo while the boy did his homework and watched him try to write the letters that would one day become a confident signature. He watched Leela learn to read from a book he had brought, childish lines about little boats and big seas, and felt, in the soft way that long-suppressed feelings re-emerge, a small sense of repair. The company's mural, quietly mounted by volunteers, became a symbol, not of a rescue, but of shared existence. Faces pinned to the board were not meant to be trophies. They were reminders that names and stories matter. Ricardo quietly asked that his contribution be anonymous. He did not want to create an altar to his redemption. He wanted the program to live or die on its own merits. The deeper work, the personal work, between Ricardo and Sofia, progressed with stuttered hope. There were arguments, sharp and clean, about boundaries and entitlement. There were disclosures that unsettled him. Sofia had never told him about an instance when she reached out and was met with indignation rather than listening. He owned the failure without flinching. There were small, tender moments that felt like new liturgies, a shared cup of coffee in the morning, an awkward hug when words felt insufficient, Leela running to him with drawings like worn treasures. One evening, months into the project, Sofia invited him to meet Leela's teacher. It was a small, formal gesture, a sign that the relationship was moving from negotiation into routine. The teacher, a sturdy woman with a patient laugh, spoke of Leela's curiosity and how she wrote her name in big, looping letters. "She's brave," the teacher said. "She has seen much, but she asks questions." Ricardo laid a small envelope on the table, a modest amount to help secure a weekly childcare session, so Sofia could accept a stable night shift job she had been offered. Sofia's eyes flashed with annoyance first, because she hated the symbolism of accepting help, and then softened into something that looked like relief. "Dad," she said, the word both a weapon and a shelter.
Ricardo met it with the only humility he had left to offer. "Not a show of power," he said. "A practical choice. If you don't want it, send it back. If you do want it, it will be there as agreed." She accepted, on her terms. They made a plan. They set boundaries. They scheduled times when he would be present and times when he would step back. It was, in all its pragmatism, a new form of intimacy. Not everything was healed. There were nights when Ricardo would sit alone with a photograph and replay the scenes of the dump in a loop of gratitude and shame. He knew that no single act, no matter how costly, could undo the effects of absence. But he also knew that consistent human presence could alter the trajectory of lives. He had begun, in slow, clumsy ways, to trade his armor for work clothes. The narrative found its practical rhythms too. Donna Nelsa's contract was renewed after a trial period. She trained a team of cooks from the community, many of whom had been through the same rung of survival. Mateo advanced in school, his handwriting improving, his appetite steadier. The company instituted a modest scholarship program for local kids and a policy that allowed employees to volunteer during work hours. Marcelo, always the realist, softened not because he was moved theatrically, but because the pilot demonstrated lower turnover and a small but measurable boost in employee engagement. He could quantify what he had previously dismissed as sentiment. There were friction points. A disgruntled investor voiced concern about resource allocation. An employee complained that a colleague's volunteerism required juggling teams. They addressed each problem with meetings and adjustments. The work showed that change requires bureaucracy as well as bravery. Sometime after the program had been running for a year, Ricardo found himself back at the original lamppost. It was evening again, and the dump had fewer people, but the same slow, wettered heartbeat. Mateo ran up to him with a small brown paper parcel. Someone had taught him to make a neat fold, like the cocina of the first night, only now it held a tiny hand-rolled bun with a tooth-marked corner. "Open," Mateo said. Ricardo unwrapped it carefully. The smell rose to meet him, warm, familiar, strangely sacred in its ordinariness. He took a bite and felt the same uncomplicated comfort that had begun him on this path. "Do you remember?" Mateo asked, his eyes wide, as if the memory belonged to them both. "I remember," Ricardo said. He wanted to be honest, to tell Mateo what the night had taught him in bigger terms, but the boy needed simpler truths. "Thank you for the bread," Mateo said. He meant it as if a single phrase could hold the ceremony. Ricardo looked across the dump. Rosa was there, and Lila was kicking a small tin can that sang like a bell.
Sophia stood nearby with a container of soup she had prepared to share.
She nodded at Ricardo, a small, steady recognition that no longer required filling with grand gestures. He walked to Sophia and stood at a comfortable distance. He did not need to perform anything. "How was the job?" he asked. "It's steady," she said. "I'm learning the schedule." "And Leela?" he asked. "She's learning to stop worrying about the night," Sophia replied. "She sleeps through most of it now." There was a silence that felt like blessing, not because it sealed all wounds, but because it acknowledged that something ongoing had been started. He had not rescued anyone. He had not bought a life. He had offered persistent presence and resources used in ways that respected people's autonomy. It was not a tidy redemption. It was messy and real. At the company, the mural was fuller. Faces penned there were not a proof of his virtue. They were the index of a community, a record of small claims and small victories. Employees took turns working on community projects, learning how to document the work properly for sustainability, making sure the program had measurable goals and human-centered metrics. Silvana had become its tireless shepherd, and Marcelo, while never sentimental, had become an advocate for a program he still defended with spreadsheets. There were inevitable critiques from outside, that a wealthy man was trying to soothe his conscience, that wealth always seeks absolution. Ricardo heard the critiques without being crushed. He had learned, slowly, to accept criticism and to let accountability be part of the project. He learned that good intentions required translation into structures that could be judged and improved. One crisp morning, a year and a half after the boy's sentence had split his life, Ricardo received an invitation of a different kind. The company had arranged a community day, a quiet celebration without fanfare, to plant a small garden behind the community center where people who had been part of the pilot could grow herbs and vegetables. It was not staged for press. There were no cameras. It was meant to stitch together a community of people who had been the edges of the city's life. Ricardo arrived with a simple toolbox. Leela ran toward him with a trowel in hand and a ribbon that had been braided into her hair like a small victory flag. He knelt and dug a small hole beside her. They planted a sapling that would, with care, become a tree whose shade might someday cool children who did not yet know his name. The ritual was small and utterly ordinary. Mateo showed him a list he had written in a school notebook. He had saved coins and had learned to count them. He wanted to buy a small book of stories for the community library. Ricardo slipped a bill into the boy's hand and told him he could choose the book himself. They walked together to the little bookstall on the corner, as if the city had been condensed into a neighborhood base.
The truth that the boy had revealed that night at the dump had not been merely the location of a woman and a child. It had been an invitation to look at absence and at presence, at the edges of his life, at how distance and protection can ossify into indifference. The sentence, "Sir, I saw them at the dump," had frozen him initially because it had unmasked a tender point he had avoided. The revelation had been equal parts accusation and salvation, because it forced him into the immediate moral calculus that no spreadsheet could adequately capture. At the end of the day, when the sapling was watered and the last shovel put away, Ricardo stood back and watched the small constellation of people dispersed across the community center's courtyard. He had a long way to go. There were policy meetings and budgets and the slow work of changing corporate culture, but he had also found a new rhythm. He learned that attention given steadily is more radical than one-off largesse. He discovered that connection, once reopened, required care much like a fragile plant. As dusk came, Mateo ran up with another paper parcel. He handed Ricardo a tiny, handmade coxina, its dough shaped imperfectly by small palms. It was almost comedic how humble it was, and exactly right. Ricardo opened it and took a bite. "Do you remember the first one?" Mateo asked, exultant. "I do," Ricardo said. He felt full in a way he could not reduce to numbers. The grief that had hallowed him was not erased. It had been repurposed into a steadying ache that made him show up. Sophia approached and stood near him, her presence neither clinging nor distant. She handed him a small folded note. He unfolded it with the care of someone handling a fragile manuscript. Inside was a line she had written in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for showing up." It was not a romantic closing or a tidy absolution. It was a real sentence from an adult who had been given the choice to accept help and had chosen to do so on her terms. Ricardo folded it back and held it for a moment, as if cradling something that would need tending. Later, when people asked him how it felt to have the needle move after so much silence,
Ricardo would find his reply in the simple fact that the world had asked for him to be present, and he had answered. He did not claim heroism. He claimed imperfect, continual work. At the end of the project's first full year, the company quietly incorporated the pilot into a standing community outreach policy. The program had become less about one man's guilt and more about institutional responsibility to neighbors who had names and stories and the right to be part of the city's shared life. The policy had metrics and audits and training programs. It had Silvana's fingerprints on every page, and she had the satisfaction of knowing that a bureaucratic structure could carry tenderness if nourished by people who insisted it.
In the months that followed, people in the company spontaneously organized a library drive. Employees signed up to tutor, and a small group volunteered regularly in the community garden. Mateo's handwriting improved enough that he wrote Ricardo in confident letters on a note that read, "Thank you." Ricardo kept the note on his bedside table among the photographs that had once been proof of absence and had become fragile evidence of movement. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit with a photograph of his daughter and wonder how many small, avoidable separations the city held. He could not fix everything. He had learned to accept that the moral work is not about finishing, but continuing. He had learned to trust presence over pronouncement. Years later, someone would tell the story of a man who had learned to be human again because a boy offered him a pastry and the honesty of a sentence. They would get a lot of details wrong. They would make his gestures more dramatic than they had been, and they would forget the long hours of paperwork that made dignity possible. But at the heart of the story, the truth would remain. A small, brave witness, Mateo, had said 3 words that unlatched a life, and the man had chosen to act. On a bright morning, Ricardo walked through the cafeteria where Dona Nusa supervised a line of cooks who had been trained through the program. He paused as a child, one of the scholarship recipients, read aloud from a book to a small group of younger kids. The little library shelves were tidy now. A mural at the back showed a tree whose leaves were handprints in bright paint. He put his hand over a handprint he had added months ago and felt the small, absurd comfort of leaving a mark that was meant to last. As he passed the counter, Mateo slipped a paper parcel into his hand. "Open it," the boy whispered. He did. It was a coxinha, a humble pastry, warmed and wrapped in a napkin. He bit into it and felt the comfort of a world that had, by small acts, become larger and kinder. Ricardo looked at Mateo, at Rosa, at Sofia, who stood to the side with a small, neutral smile. He thought of the sentence that had started it all. "Sir, I saw them at the dump." He thought of how truth, spoken by someone without power, can stop a man in his tracks and force him to do the hard work he had avoided for years. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, not because it proved anything, but because it reminded him that promises must be kept by the people who make them. The city hummed around them, with all its noise and disorder and stubborn beauty. He felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who had found his way back to the practice of seeing people as they are, whole, complicated, deserving. If this story stayed with you, if a small voice ever made you look twice, share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness can be practiced and that promises are worth keeping. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe and come back. There are always more lives being mended, one small act at a time.